There is a quiet assumption we carry into history without ever questioning it, that gold was the ultimate measure of value in the medieval world. Kings hoarded it. Wars were fought over it. Legends were built around it. But that assumption is wrong. In medieval Europe, if a village had to choose between losing its gold or losing its blacksmith, the choice was not even a debate. Gold could disappear for years, and life would continue. The blacksmith could vanish for a week, and the village would begin to collapse. This is the part of history that rarely makes it into textbooks. Because gold shines. Blacksmiths worked in smoke. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. Gold was rare, beautiful, and universally desired. A blacksmith was just a man covered in soot, hammering iron all day. Yet medieval society did not function on beauty or symbolism. It functioned on survival, leverage, and systems. And the blacksmith sat at the center of all three. If you strip medieval life down to its essentials, you discover something unsettling. Almost every activity that kept people alive depended on forged metal. Food, protection, transportation, law, war, even medicine. All of it ran through the forge. Plows broke, horseshoes wore down, knives dulled, locks failed, armor cracked, chains snapped. When metal failed, nothing moved forward. Gold, by contrast, did nothing. It could not cut wheat. It could not defend a town. It could not shoe a horse or mend a gate. Gold stored value, but blacksmiths created value. This distinction mattered far more in the medieval world than it does today. We live inside an abstract economy. Medieval people lived inside a material economy. Survival depended on physical tools, and physical tools depended on metallurgical skill. The blacksmith was not a craftsman on the sidelines. He was the backbone of the system. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Without blacksmiths, medieval civilization would have reverted to subsistence chaos within months. This is why blacksmiths occupied a strange social position. They were not nobles, but nobles depended on them. They were not priests, but their knowledge was guarded like sacred text. They were not warriors, yet armies rose and fell on the quality of their work. A blacksmith did not simply make things. He controlled access to transformation, the ability to turn raw earth into functional power. Iron ore was useless in the ground. Wood was just fuel. Heat alone achieved nothing. It was the blacksmith who understood the invisible thresholds: temperature, carbon content, timing, quenching, tempering. These were not written sciences. They were embodied knowledge, passed from master to apprentice through observation, failure, and scars. Most medieval blacksmiths could not read or write, yet they manipulated complex material properties that modern engineers would later formalize centuries afterward. This is why blacksmithing knowledge was fiercely protected. Unlike farming techniques, which spread across regions, advanced forging methods stayed local. Certain villages became famous not for their wealth, but for their blades. Certain families became indispensable not because of lineage, but because of skill. A well-made sword could determine the outcome of a battle. A poorly forged one could get its owner killed. This placed blacksmiths in a paradoxical position: indispensable, but dangerous. Rulers understood something deeply pragmatic: control the blacksmith or lose control of the realm. A blacksmith could arm rebels as easily as soldiers. He could sabotage an army by producing brittle blades or ill-fitted armor. His workshop was not just a place of labor, it was a strategic asset. This is why blacksmiths were often granted special protections, exemptions from certain taxes, and even land. In some regions, harming a blacksmith carried harsher penalties than harming other craftsmen. Not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. Gold did not scare kings. Skilled hands did. There is another layer most people miss. Blacksmiths did not only serve elites, they served everyone. Farmers depended on them for plowshares and sickles. Carpenters needed nails, hinges, and saws. Merchants relied on locks, scales, and reinforced wagons. Even monasteries required bells, tools, and architectural hardware. The blacksmith was the connective tissue of medieval society, the one profession that intersected with every class. If you remove a lord, the peasants still plant crops. If you remove a priest, people still wake up and work. If you remove the blacksmith, everything starts breaking at once. This is why blacksmiths were rarely poor. They might not have worn silk or lived in castles, but they had leverage. They could negotiate. They could refuse. They could relocate. And when they did, villages followed. Gold could be stolen. Land could be seized. A blacksmith's skill could not be taken by force. And this is where the story turns darker, because blacksmiths were also feared. Fire, noise, transformation, these were not neutral symbols in the medieval imagination. The forge looked unnatural. Iron glowed like something alive. The blacksmith worked at night, controlled fire, and reshaped matter. It is no coincidence that folklore often portrayed blacksmiths as liminal figures, half respected, half suspected. In some regions, blacksmiths were believed to possess magical knowledge. In others, they were associated with curses or bargains. This was not superstition alone. It was an intuitive recognition of power that people could not explain. When you don't understand how something works but you depend on it, you mythologize it. And blacksmithing worked. The real tragedy is that modern narratives reduce blacksmiths to background characters, quaint artisans in historical dramas, pounding away in the corner while kings make decisions. But this framing reverses reality. Kings made decisions because blacksmiths made tools. This is the pattern history repeats over and over. Societies glorify symbols of value while ignoring systems of value creation. Gold was visible. Blacksmiths were noisy, dirty, and inconvenient. Yet when supply chains collapse, it is not gold that saves people. It is skill. It is repair. It is the ability to make things work again. Medieval people understood this viscerally. Which raises a dangerous question for the present. If blacksmiths were more valuable than gold in a world built on physical survival, what roles play that same function today, quietly holding civilization together while being culturally undervalued? And what happens when those roles disappear? The medieval world collapsed not when it lost wealth, but when it lost knowledge. And the forge was where knowledge lived. To understand why medieval blacksmiths were more valuable than gold, you have to stop thinking about them as craftsmen and start seeing them as infrastructure. Modern societies hide infrastructure. Electricity flows invisibly through walls. Supply chains stretch across oceans. We forget they exist until they fail. Medieval societies had no such illusion. Infrastructure was loud, hot, and standing in the middle of the village. The forge was not optional. It was not decorative. It was as essential as the well. And unlike land or livestock, it could not function without expertise. This is where gold begins to look strangely fragile. Gold has value only inside a functioning system. It assumes stability, trade routes, law, enforcement, and trust. The moment any of those collapse, gold becomes ornamental metal. You cannot eat it. You cannot defend yourself with it. You cannot fix a broken plow with it. Iron, on the other hand, is value under pressure. Blacksmiths turned iron into continuity. Consider agriculture, the foundation of medieval life. Every harvest depended on metal edges. Plowshares had to be reshaped each season. Sickles needed sharpening. Hoes fractured under rocky soil. Without constant maintenance, yields collapsed. Famine followed quickly. There was no industrial replacement pipeline, no warehouses full of spare parts. When tools broke, they had to be reforged locally, or not at all. This made blacksmiths indispensable not once, but continuously. Now consider transport. Medieval roads were brutal on equipment. Wagon axles cracked, wheel rims warped, horseshoes wore thin and caused lameness. A merchant without a functioning wagon was effectively bankrupt. A farmer without a horse was immobilized. Every mile traveled passed through the blacksmith's hands. Then there was security. Castles were not just stone, they were iron. Hinges, portcullises, chains, grates, locks, and reinforcement bands all required forged metal. City gates depended on complex ironwork to function. A single failed hinge could compromise an entire fortification. Armor was even more demanding. Chainmail alone required thousands of individually riveted rings. Helmets had to balance hardness with flexibility. Too brittle and they shattered. Too soft and they caved in. This balance was not theoretical. It was learned through experience, iteration, and failure. Gold could decorate armor. Iron decided whether it worked. Which is why blacksmiths were not interchangeable. A mediocre blacksmith could ruin an army. A great one could give a smaller force an overwhelming advantage. This is why rulers competed for skilled smiths just as aggressively as they did for land or alliances. Some blacksmiths traveled with armies. Others were quietly relocated behind castle walls. Their presence was strategic, not cosmetic. And then there was scarcity. Iron ore existed in many places, but usable ore did not. Smelting was inefficient. Charcoal production destroyed forests. Fuel shortages were common. Every bar of workable iron represented enormous labor investment. Waste was unacceptable. Blacksmiths operated under constant constraints, which forced precision. This is why medieval tools often lasted generations. They were designed to be repaired, reforged, and adapted. A broken blade was not discarded. It was reborn. Nothing was disposable. Gold, by contrast, encouraged hoarding, and hoarding creates fragility. There is another overlooked dimension: time. Blacksmiths compressed time. A skilled smith could turn days of labor into hours of function. A broken plow fixed before planting season meant survival. Fixed after meant starvation. Timing mattered as much as material. This temporal leverage gave blacksmiths power no currency could match. People waited for gold. They needed blacksmiths now. Which brings us to social hierarchy. Medieval societies were rigid. Birth defined your ceiling. But blacksmiths quietly bent this rule. Their skills gave them negotiating power uncommon for non-nobles. They could refuse unfair treatment. They could relocate. They could demand protection. Some blacksmith families accumulated generational influence rivaling minor nobility, not through titles but through dependency. And dependency breeds respect, but also resentment. Because blacksmiths were not easily replaceable, communities tolerated behaviors they would not accept from others. Smiths worked odd hours, charged premium rates, withheld services if insulted. This fed myths of arrogance or secrecy, yet beneath the tension was a simple reality: they were irreplaceable. Gold could be taxed, land could be seized. A blacksmith's knowledge walked away. This is why apprenticeship systems were so tightly controlled. Training a blacksmith took years. Mistakes were costly. Injuries were common. The forge was unforgiving. Knowledge transfer was slow by design. You could not scale blacksmithing, and that is precisely why it was valuable. Gold scales infinitely. You can mint more coins. You can inflate supply. You can abstract value. Skill does not inflate. It concentrates, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. The medieval economy was not powered by wealth. It was powered by competence. Gold measured transactions. Blacksmiths enabled life. When plagues hit, gold failed. When wars disrupted trade, gold failed. When systems broke down, blacksmiths became even more critical. Repair mattered more than accumulation. Function mattered more than appearance. And this is where modern storytelling misleads us. We romanticize kings and treasure, but survival depended on people who could fix reality. The blacksmith did not speculate. He produced, he repaired, He adapted. His value was not symbolic. It was immediate and measurable, which is why, when medieval societies declined, it was often not due to lack of gold, but loss of skilled labor. When knowledge chains broke, recovery took generations. The forge going cold was not a metaphor. It was collapse. And history has a habit of repeating itself. Every civilization has its blacksmiths, roles that quietly sustain the system while receiving little recognition, roles that are difficult, unscalable, and deeply embodied, roles that matter far more than symbolic wealth. The medieval world knew exactly who those people were. The question is whether we still do. By the time medieval societies began to fracture through war, plague, or political collapse, the true hierarchy of value was revealed with brutal clarity. Gold vanished first. Trade routes broke. Coinage lost meaning. Hoards were buried, stolen, or rendered useless in places where nothing could be bought. Wealth became abstract at exactly the moment abstraction stopped working. But blacksmiths did not vanish with the money. If anything, they became more important. Because collapse is not defined by poverty, it is defined by breakage. Things stop working. Tools fail faster than they can be replaced. Infrastructure degrades. Repairs matter more than innovation. Survival becomes a matter of maintaining function with limited resources. And no profession was better adapted to this reality than the blacksmith. Blacksmiths were masters of constraint. They worked with imperfect materials, inconsistent fuel, and unpredictable demand. They recycled constantly. Broken weapons became tools. Old tools became nails. Nails became hinges. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. This mindset, repair over replacement, is the opposite of how modern economies think. But it is exactly how resilient systems survive. Medieval blacksmiths did not ask, "How do we produce more?" They asked, "How do we make this last?" That question alone made them more valuable than gold, because gold rewards accumulation. Blacksmithing rewards continuity. This is why blacksmiths persisted through the darkest periods of medieval history. While cities shrank and elites disappeared, forges continued burning in villages, monasteries, and fortified towns. As long as someone could heat metal and shape it, civilization had a foothold. The forge was not just a workplace, it was a node of recovery. And this brings us to the final inversion most people miss. Blacksmiths were valuable not because they produced weapons, but because they produced repairability. Weapons end conflicts. Repair sustains life. A society that can repair itself survives longer than one that can merely defend itself. Medieval people learned this lesson repeatedly, the hard way. And then, slowly, they forgot it. As centralized power grew, blacksmithing was standardized, regulated, and eventually industrialized. Skill became segmented. Knowledge became specialized. What had once been embodied understanding turned into procedural labor. This made production faster, but it also made societies dependent. When industrial systems work, they outperform medieval forges by orders of magnitude. When they fail, there is no fallback. A medieval village could lose its lord and survive. A modern city can lose electricity for days and unravel. This is not progress or decline. It is a trade-off. Medieval societies valued blacksmiths because they understood fragility. They lived close enough to collapse to recognize what truly mattered. Gold was a luxury of stability. Skill was the currency of survival. And that is the deeper message hidden inside this history. Every era has its gold. Every era has its blacksmiths. One is celebrated. The other is essential. Today, we still reward symbols over systems. We glorify wealth while neglecting the skills that quietly keep reality functioning. Maintenance, repair, infrastructure, embodied knowledge. The modern blacksmiths are everywhere and almost invisible, until something breaks. Then suddenly, value becomes very clear. The medieval world did not worship blacksmiths out of nostalgia or superstition. It depended on them because dependency is honest. When survival is on the line, illusion collapses. Gold shines only when everything else works. Blacksmiths matter when nothing else does. And that is why, in a world without safety nets, without abstractions, without guarantees, medieval blacksmiths were not just more useful than gold, they were more valuable.